Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. He is Daniel Gallen. We're coming to you live from Beaver Stadium as we record here on Saturday evening. Penn State picked up its first loss of 2024 here on home turf this afternoon, falling to Ohio State 20-13, 8 straight losses in this series against the Buckeyes. Both of these teams now 7-1 on the season. The Big Ten title chase gets a little more complicated. We'll talk about what the postseason impact looks like a little bit later here in the show. But first things first, Daniel, a promising start for the Nittany Lions, number 3 in the nation. Of course, Ohio State, number 4 coming into today. 10-0 lead for the Nittany Lions. They marched down the field, used about half of the first quarter, get a field goal, and then a quick pick six from Zion Tracy. This place is going nuts. There's a record-setting attendance, 111,000. And yet, we're here to talk about a very familiar script and a defeat to the Buckeyes.
Yeah, it was definitely something where at different times you felt like you've seen this before, where Penn State just can't quite seem to move the ball on offense. The defense, for the most part, is standing tall. And then you watch Ohio State inch away, some field goals here, a touchdown here, and suddenly a game that looked like it was in the balance, or that you had a chance to assert yourself in and take control in, suddenly you're down to the wire and you only have one more chance really to get in and make it a game. And once again, Ohio State made one or two more plays than Penn State did. I thought that this year's game was interesting because it didn't feel like Penn State got beat by that one uber talent that Ohio State has. Last year it was Marvin Harrison Jr. 2 years ago, I think it was a combination of CJ Stroud and that wide receiver core. I thought that today Ohio State played a very, very complete game. And you could see how close the teams are, but at the same time that it really magnified just those margins, the difference that can make in a game like this.
We talked a lot about, and I specifically talked about this before this matchup, about that maybe Penn State would actually have the edge in the trenches today. And that hasn't been the case throughout much of this series. Long story short, that really didn't transpire here at Penn State today. You saw the defensive line of Ohio State not necessarily hassling Drew Aller throughout this matchup, but they came through with back-to-back sacks in a key possession during the second half. And they did not allow Penn State to establish balance offensively. And we talked about that being such an integral piece of what the Nittany Lions were aiming to accomplish on Saturday, and really the blueprint towards picking up that rare victory against the Buckeyes. And what did you see today? You saw Drew Aller was the team's leading rusher, I believe, at halftime. At the end of the game, Tyler Warren is the team's leading rusher with 47 yards on the ground. And this is the 5 times now, the 5th time through 8 games here for Penn State where they have not gotten to 45 rushing yards as a running back group. You had Nick Singleton, Kaytron Allen today combined for 18 carries, 42 yards. Only once during this 8-game losing streak have we seen Penn State running backs collectively reach 75 yards. And we're talking about Nick Singleton, Kaytron Allen, Saquon Barkley, Miles Sanders among the weapons that have been available in the backfield. And yet, whether you look at the push up front, you look at the play of the defense across the field for the Buckeyes, and ultimately some shortcomings in the plan for Penn State. Again, that kind of a similar script here where these guys aren't getting going, your offense doesn't get going, and at the end of the day, you don't score an offensive touchdown for the first time since 2014. You did a little bit of digging on this in post-game, Daniel. 10 years have gone by since Penn State last was left out of the end zone, and it just so happens here at the center of the college football universe on this first Saturday of November 2024, when once again we see a bit of an egg laid by this offense. Let's remember last year they scored their only touchdown in Columbus in the final minute when they were down 20-6. So it has been tough sledding, regardless of who the offensive coordinator is.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about the job that Andy Kotelnicki has done with this offense, and I think that for the most part, it's been probably near unanimous praise in terms of what this offense has been this year, as opposed to what it was for much of last year, including in those big games against Ohio State and Michigan. But like you said, they laid an egg today, and this is probably the worst possible time you could have done it. I know that if you ask James Franklin, they're all big games, so any other time this year would have been a bad time to lay an egg. But at this point, you're 7-0. You're ranked number 3 in the country. You got game day. You got big noon kickoff. You got 111,000 people in the stands, and you can't deliver. It's just a very, very tough thing to put out there. Like you said, the running game just really stood out. I mean, you look at this box score at the end of the game, and it's confusing, I think, to put it lightly. Tyler Warren is your leading rusher. Drew Aller is your second leading rusher. Nick Singleton is your leading receiver. Like, there's just all of these. The offense is just very, mishmashed in that box score. It's kind of clear that Penn State didn't really have an identity offensively today. There weren't really those long, sustained drives outside of that first drive to open the game. And at the same time, you only get 3 points out of that. And this is a game that you needed 7s across the board. So this offense just left a lot to be desired. Sal Wormley said that the Ohio State defense did some different things that wasn't on tape up front, and that stymied them a little bit in the running game. Katron Allen and Nick Singleton averaged, I think, 2.3 yards per carry combined. So that definitely shows there. But just overall, just a bit of a tough watch. I think that we'd seen the ability to generate some big plays over the past couple of weeks, and we didn't really see those until that last offensive drive when Tyler Warren kind of put things into his own hands. And even then, that wasn't enough.
How about this? Ohio State did not score any touchdowns in the red zone today. Penn State had 3 trips to the red zone. Could have been a real separating factor. They got a field goal out of one of them, and they ended up with no points out of the other 2 trips. We'll cover what the goal line stand looked like for the Buckeyes and the goal line failures for Penn State's offense in just a moment, and what basically made the game with about 5 minutes to go. But you go back earlier in the contest to the end of the first half, where Drew Aller is looking in the direction of Harrison Wallace toward the sideline of the end zone, the right sideline. And we think that it's an incomplete pass. And then upon further review, there's an incredible interception made by Ohio State's cornerback, and it ends up getting a touchback. And we had 2 calls in this game that were overturned and ultimately led to touchbacks/turnovers, one of which occurred earlier when we saw Will Howard, Ohio State's quarterback, being stripped of the ball by Zakee Wheatley, a tremendous individual effort right before the goal line as he's going toward the pylon. That created some new life for Penn State. But all of a sudden, a little bit later in that very same first half, Penn State's got to go to the locker room wondering what just happened. First and goal turned into no points and no other opportunities to take a shot at the end zone or come away with a field goal. And look, we got to be honest here. Kodalnicki, Tom Allen, they were both on the wrong side of the ledger today in those coordinator matchups versus Jim Knowles and Chip Kelly. But the guy that's got to answer for it at the end of the day, and has been really throughout this Ohio State Penn State conversation, is James Franklin. He's now 1-10 in this series for his career. He's now got 8 consecutive losses, and look, I think 4 of them have been by single possession margins, but no one cares. And the first 2 were 1-point losses, but again, no one cares. It's just show me the victory. James Franklin said afterwards, Daniel, that he owns all of it. He said he understands the frustration from the fans, and there were some booing. I think there were a smattering of people shouting that they felt like there should be a coaching change as James Franklin and the team were walking off the field. He's told us that the guys in the locker room are just as frustrated, if not more frustrated, than the fans would be. And he also said that college football has changed. He said, quote, "We have an opportunity to move forward and right some wrongs from today." I think the point we'll get into a little bit later before we close out this episode, Daniel, is that a loss to Ohio State does feel a bit different because we don't have the divisions in play. We don't have a 4-team playoff in play. So for postseason, it doesn't wipe everything off the table. But this is a gut punch. And, where is it punched directly? At the gut of James Franklin. And he's going to have to wear this one. We know what the national narrative is going to be. We know how his record looks in primetime matchups like this against top 5 opponents and maybe program-altering opportunities. And it ends up kind of repeatedly now being a situation where James Franklin's got to come out of that game and answer tough questions instead of coming out of these games, beating his chest and saying, look what we just did as a program.
Yeah, Penn State is still great, and they're not yet elite. That's where we are, 6 years later now? And you have a group of guys that included 2 that we spoke to after the game, and Devon Elise and Sal Wormley, who came in right after that, and they have lost 6 times in a row to Ohio State. I think that when you talk about James Franklin needing to win this game and what it could do for him, I mean, this isn't a style points game. This is the past couple of years. This has really morphed into a knockdown, drag out type of game. Which, given how sometimes you think about the players that Ohio State has had and the fireworks they've been able to generate, and then some of the talent that Penn State has had, and what we've seen them do at different times, it is kind of interesting how it ends up being like these real, kind of short, close quarters battles. And so, if it was 21-20, the fan base would have loved it. Everyone would have taken it. If it was, 2-0, I feel like the fans would take it. Like, there's just, that desire to win this game and to get over the hump. The players that we talk to post game, they feel like they're close. They feel like this is something that they can do. But it's one thing to say it, and it's another thing to do it. I think that we talk a lot about how James Franklin talks about certain position groups, where in 2022, it was that offensive line group that needed to prove it. I think the wide receivers were a little similar to that this year in terms of, all right, they need to prove it. It's been that way for James Franklin and Ohio State for a while. And I think this year it kind of reinforces that even more, where it's kind of like, okay, it's prove it time. Like, we need to see it. We don't care how it gets done. It just needs to get done. And once again, it doesn't get done.
This is, I think when you talk about some of those issues on the offense, and we can talk about that now, wide receivers, 3 total catches for 49 yards. Trey Wallace had 2 of those catches for 45 yards. Again, there's a ball there. He's got his hands on it. It's in the end zone. It ends up going the other way. It's going to the other team. And so that's something that folks are going to look at with this matchup. Where's the wide receiver play? And then ultimately, QB1, Daniel. We spent a lot of time this week discussing Drew Aller and his health status. And we knew by the time we got off the field Wednesday evening, getting to look at him on the practice field, he was lining up to play today. And he was not even questionable on the pregame availability report. He started today, finished 12 of 20 for 146 yards, had that one interception that we discussed earlier. I thought it was a good ball and a good place, 60% on the day. And he actually made some plays with his legs. I think he had 3 first downs moving the chain. So this isn't a game where I'm going to say Drew was impaired, or Drew was clearly limited, and why weren't they getting Bo Perbula involved? And that's not really what this is about, but it comes down to, can your 5-star quarterback in crunch time maybe elevate those around him? And I know that we've seen Drew Aller do that in some key moments. Second half against USC comes to mind. He has made plays. He's had a stepping stone kind of season, but that went off the path today. And now you got to wonder where he's at. We heard from Kobe King that he felt like Drew Aller's demeanor coming out of this game was different than where he was last year in Columbus, when he was very emotional. We saw that in post game. There were some tears out there. He was a sophomore, first-time starter. Now he's a team captain. And look, regardless of how he responds, we'll get into that kind of turning the page later. But what did you think about what we saw from Aller over the course of action today? It's just, people aren't really going to pay much attention nationally anymore to what he did against USC, how it went in the first half against Wisconsin, his performance in week 1 against West Virginia. People want to know what Drew Aller looks like against Ohio State and Michigan last year. And if they played Oregon this year, that they'd want to know what he looks like in that particular game and what this offense looks like in this particular game. And I shared something with you as someone who very much embedded in the football world, but does not pay a ton of close attention to Penn State, but they know I do. They text me after this one. They said, today's Penn State offense summed up in one word: unimaginative. And this is a guy who doesn't know much about Andy Kotelnicki. And I almost wanted to say, man, that is the exact opposite of how we were describing this offense through the first 7 games. So how do you attach that to Kotelnicki, to Drew Aller, and kind of work through what didn't happen today for this offense?
Yeah, I'll start with that point from your football world connection, where I think that unimaginative, I think that mostly describes that sequence at the goal line at the end of the game. I mean, that was just, Venga Ioane was going in motion, but nothing interesting was happening after that. And then, I think for the most part, it never really felt like Kotelnicki was in a rhythm. I think there was one point where I tweeted like, okay, now it feels like they're moving the ball. Now it feels like they're reeling off some chunk plays. They're doing some interesting things. But it didn't really happen overall. in terms of Drew Aller, you talk about him being a 5-star who can elevate his game like he did at USC. It felt like maybe he and Tyler Warren were going to do that on that last drive, where they go 72 yards and 64 of those came on 2 Tyler Warren plays. First you have a 31-yard pass to Warren where he just kind of ripped the ball away from Lathan Ransom. I initially thought that was a pick or a PBU. Somehow Warren came up with it. Nice play up the right sideline. And when Drew made that throw, I was like, okay, Aller is feeling it. He knows what he needs to do. This team knows what they need to do at this point in the game. And then when you talk about Warren, he takes that direct snap on 3rd down, bounces it outside, which when he did that, I thought he was going to get stopped short, a yard short, but somehow gets to the corner, takes it down to the 3. That's when you're like, okay, the 5-star quarterback and the do everything tight end have said, we're done. We're taking over. Like we're tying this game up. And then I'm sure we'll get into the sequence a little bit deeper of what happened after that.
Let's do it right now. I mean, because they got down to, so Tyler Warren, let's just set the stage a little bit. He comes up with 2 30-plus yard gains when they're down by 7. They're in the 4th quarter. He rips the ball away from a talented defensive back for one. And then, like you said, took it to another gear. I did not know Tyler Warren had that, open field, get to the edge, burst in him at 6'6", 260. But we keep learning more about him here in year 5. And so it's basically like, okay, Tyler Warren just ripped off his jersey and he's got the Superman outfit underneath there. And what is the response to that? You go 3 straight inside runs to Katron Allen, who we know is a grinder. He's a tough SOB at that position, but it wasn't working in this particular situation. And quite frankly, it wasn't working throughout the day leading up to that point. And you get yourself in a spot where now it's do or die on 4th and short. Drew Aller told us later they were looking to get the ball to Tyler Warren in that situation. He wasn't available because of what the defensive approached it with. They end up trying to get to Khalil Dinkins. They don't connect, and that's your one shot. And so I think you got 4 plays at the 3-yard line because of the way this was effectively called. Drew Aller was not a factor for 3 of them, and Tyler Warren was not a factor for 3 of them. And you could only hope that he could become a factor on that 4th if you get the right read from Ohio State. So to me, they really let Ohio State dictate to them how they were going to use Tyler Warren versus saying, you know what, we got a hot hand right now. This guy's like deserves to be a Heisman Trophy contender. He is a freak. He's 6'6", 260. Let's try him on one of these. I think that was the frustration. Like, why don't you find a way? You're giving this guy snaps in all sorts of situations all season, here, there, everywhere. You trust him. You hear about it all the time. Why not give him one shot to say, I am Superman. I'm Tyler Warren. This is my year. And now watch me posterize a Buckeyes defensive back, get into the end zone, bowl some people over. All of a sudden, it's a tie game and everything's possible. I think we would have loved to see him get that opportunity. And I think that's a big part of why people are really lamenting how it went down at the goal line.
Definitely. And you think back to the USC game last month, there was a sequence down by the goal line. I think it ended with a field goal, and they force-fed the ball to Warren 3 straight times near the goal line or in the end zone. And that's in the first half of a game. The game flow is a little different. But that was a moment where I think at this point in the year, I'm like, no such thing as too much Tyler Warren. But at the time, I was like, okay, this might be a little much. Like, you've got other players on the field. But in this type of situation, you got to go to that guy who has been the guy for you all year. None of the wide receivers have been the guy consistently. I think Harrison Wallace has been good this year, but he hasn't been that guy that in crunch time, you're like, okay, we're going to throw him the ball. Like you said, the run game, normally I think you would be fine with running Katron Allen a couple times in this situation, but the run game was just not really there today. They weren't getting consistent push up front. The running backs weren't picking up yards on a consistent basis either. And so just to go in and do that 3 times, maybe it's James Franklin and Andy Kotelnicki trying to make some sort of statement. Maybe it's them thinking this is our best way to do it. But suddenly it's 4th and goal. You've already been stuffed 3 times in a row. Like, are you actually going to go back to that? And then Ohio State read everything perfectly and really forced Aller into a tough throw into a crowd for Dinkins. We know Dinkins has been reliable in that type of situation before, but in a lot of those plays, he schemed wide open, and there was just a lot of traffic there. It was one of those plays that happened really quickly. You're in a condensed area. You got to be decisive. I did think Aller was decisive with what he did, but I just think Penn State just didn't give itself a chance to be successful in that situation, and it really came back to bite them.
This wasn't like Penn State was like just getting very small opportunities for possessions. They had the ball for just about 29 minutes in this matchup, and we just didn't see a lot. I don't want to say it wasn't a concerted effort, but there really wasn't any opportunity and for either running back. But I'm looking at Nick Singleton because he's got only 6 carries on the book. And I feel like I said this last year after the Ohio State game. If you think Nick Singleton is a guy who can change the game for you, and we've seen him do it through the passing game. We saw that early. He had a team high 6 catches on the day. He had a 19-yard gain for one of them. But kind of an afterthought as a runner. I think he had one big run last year against Columbus, and then essentially he wasn't even involved much anymore as a runner. And then I think about Beau Pribula, and I asked James about this after the game. Something he told us, James, after the Wisconsin matchup last week with Beau Pribula playing a full half, was that when he's in there, the ground game gets a jolt. The running backs by proximity are going to have more opportunities to succeed in Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton. And we saw that down the stretch against Wisconsin as their defense was starting to get gassed. In this matchup, Beau Pribula was involved in the first series, and I just don't recall him being involved much after halftime. James said that they weren't getting the results that they wanted when they had Beau out there early on, and they went away from it. I just wonder, going back to what he said, Beau Pribula is the guy who opens things for running backs. I don't recall in this matchup seeing many of those opportunities. And I know there's a finite amount of snaps. You don't want to get Drew Aller off the field. But after all the talk this week about how much confidence there was in Beau, if he had to be the guy, and what we already know about the tangible things he brings to a rushing attack, I thought on a day where yet again it's getting away from you and your running backs who are really talented aren't a factor. This is classic Penn State versus Ohio State. Beau Pribula maybe can give you a jolt, but I understand why you can't try everything in a game. But to me, that was something that was missing. They went away from it. They never went back to it. And look, I just think Beau, if Kotelnicki's right, and Kotelnicki's been telling us since the spring that he thinks Beau Pribula is one of the elite athletes on this roster, sure felt like a day where you needed some elite athleticism to counter what the Buckeyes were doing. Because on the ground, it just wasn't working. And when it's not working on the ground, that means Drew Aller has to scrap and claw for everything through the air in a way that otherwise he wouldn't. And that ultimately, to me, left things to the question, whether it's the use of Nick Singleton, the use of Beau Pribula. Again, it feels like classic Ohio State, Penn State. We always get to the finish line and we're like, it seemed like Penn State had a plan this week. You look at the box score, you look at the player usage, and you think, where did that go?
I think with Beau Pribula, I think that you understand going away from it early, but you don't understand not coming back to it in the second half and not seeing that, okay, we've shown other stuff on offense now. Maybe let's do something a little different. It was interesting, and we can go back to Aller a little bit because there's a lot more to talk about with his day. But one thing that was interesting when Pribula was on the field, usually Aller stays on the field. That's what they did through the first half of the season. Aller would split out wide. That gave them the option of the double pass on that one play, and it's just a different look. He was leaving the field when Pribula was coming on in this game, which was something new, something we hadn't seen. And it felt like, okay, maybe they're trying to run a little bit more of the normal offense with Pribula instead of that kind of gadgety package. But I just think that it's something that they should have gone back to. And when you're talking about the running game, one thing that popped into my head was what Jalen Sider was talking about in the preseason about the Ohio State game. It was something along the lines of, both Allen and Singleton having fewer than 10 carries at Ohio State and getting away from what the team was doing well.
You could tell he was still angry about that. And that was like this summer talking about last October's game. And again, here we are. And it just feels like, look, you got 3 cracks at it with these guys as your tandem. They went for about 120 combined rushing yards a couple years ago, far and away the best that we've seen from a running back group against Ohio State during this losing streak. But this matchup and last year's matchup, you go down a list of who were the most effective, important players for Penn State. And I know that Nick did it through the air, so I don't want to shortchange that. But again, these are two players who should never be considered afterthoughts when you get to the end of the game and you say, well, what was the story today on offense? They should be more towards centerpiece, and they weren't able to do that today. And you can talk about lack of execution up front, kind of the same story in the trenches a little bit. You can talk about these guys not being able to create their own opportunities and make guys miss and break tackles and come up with something really special. But at the end of the day, you only get these running backs for a short window. You only get them for maybe 3 matchups against Ohio State. And it feels like in terms of their impact and in terms of their utilization, they peaked in this series as freshmen compared to what they've done in sophomore and junior opportunities.
I pulled it up, and last year in that performance that, like you said, really seemed to bother Jaywan Sider, 18 carries for 74 yards, a long run of 20. You look at what they did today combined, 18 carries, 42 yards, long run of 7. Just not getting what you need out of some of your best players in the biggest game of the year.
If you only tune in to the biggest games of the year for Penn State, so if you only tune in for Ohio State, Michigan, the last couple of years, you don't have a very strong opinion of Drew Aller, at least a very positive impression. You don't have a very strong opinion of who Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton are. Now, you've reviewed their body of work over 3 years, and then that changes. But again, if you are glued in to the games that quote unquote matter the most, you're not coming away thinking these guys are program changers. And let's remind folks, the number 1 quarterback in the country in the 2022 class was Drew Aller. The number 1 running back in the country that year was Nick Singleton. You had Kaytron Allen, who was a very good number 2 running back in that class. And yet in these big time matchups, whether it's the way the game is being coached or whether it's the way the performances are going, you are not walking away from this from a 1,000-foot view looking down and saying Penn State has program difference makers at these positions based on what I am witnessing against Ohio State, Michigan of the world.
Definitely. I think to go back to put a pin in the Aller conversation, just to walk everyone through, what was going on with him this week and what he did. Like you said, he was not on the availability report. He came out, he started. I think there was one series early in the game where he ran the ball 3 straight times, and we're all kind of looking around like, what? This is not what we expected. And
he looked good. He looked
good.
Yeah.
He was wearing a brace on his left knee during their final drive of the first half. During a timeout, he took the brace off, gave it to someone on the sideline, never wore it again. I went back through his post-game availability. I wasn't over there with him, but no one asked him about that. He was asked how he felt physically, and all he said was good. Sal Wormley said that there was no doubt that Drew Aller was going to play, because Sal Wormley said Drew Aller is not a softie. And so it seemed like that the team had seen Aller, had faith in what he was able to do, was healthy enough to make those plays out there. The one thing about his demeanor that we talked about last year, coming off the field in Columbus, you could tell that was something that maybe he wasn't emotionally prepared for, that something that really affected him. I think when we were upstairs before we started recording this, you mentioned that a lot of the players, no one really seemed shell-shocked by what happened on the field today. I think that last year, you could definitely say that Drew Aller came off the field shell-shocked. Watching him walk off the field, I think that in some of the photos and videos that I've seen, it's not someone who has that 1,000-yard stare or whatever. It's someone that you can tell is being really introspective and thinking things through. And I think that came through in his post-game media availability. I mean, he was very put together. I thought he was very thorough in some of his answers and explaining what was going on. He was very strong in his conviction when it came to the confidence that he has in his coaches, in his teammates, everything like that. So I think that you do come away from this seeing Drew Aller handle this kind of adversity and feel good about it. I think that over the course of the game, even though it wasn't perfect and he did leave a lot to be desired, it wasn't like last year where you felt like he can't even complete a pass, that the wheels have fallen off, the train is off the track. I think that this, like last year you felt like they can't come back from 7 down, like they can't come back from 10 down. Whereas today you saw them driving, you saw them put themselves in position to tie the game, potentially try to win it if you score and go for 2. So I think Aller, not his best game, still left a lot to be desired. Like you said, if you tune in, this is the only college football that you're watching, and you hear this kid's former 5-star, former number 1 recruit, I think that you come away kind of like, sure, like, okay, whatever you say. But I think that in the context of last year's Ohio State matchup, you've seen where he's grown, you've seen where he's more mature, but you still got to perform and you still got to get it done. And for the second straight year, he didn't do it.
And I'll just go back to that point that we talked about before we started recording. There was a sense in past post-game availabilities after this matchup and after these losses to Ohio State, whether you go all the way back to the great to elite speech that we got from James Franklin, or whether it was last year in Columbus, where even to the head coach, they were prisoners of the moment, where it felt like they were going to live in this loss for longer than they needed to. And the sense that I got talking to the veterans, I know you picked up the same from a lot of these guys, Drew Aller, Kobe King, linebacker, Sal Wormley, Devon J. Thomas, veterans that we got after the game, was very much like, this sucks. Like, we didn't want to be here. Clearly, we wanted to come out and talk about a win against Ohio State. But one, we think that because of the current college football playoff schedule, structure, that we got a bunch of life. There's still a light at the end of the tunnel. There's still a big carrot at the end of the stick that we want to chase. We need to apply corrections. And number two, something I found very interesting, a couple guys told us it in person. You had Abdul Carter tweeting it after the game. They were calling for another crack at Ohio State. Kobe King said they'd play tonight at 7 p.m. if Ohio State was up for it. So they're talking about down the road. They're going to need some help to make that happen in Indianapolis. Oregon's still unbeaten. Indiana's still unbeaten. Now you've got Ohio State with 1 loss and yourself with 1 loss, and they've got the edge on you. But who knows? The postseason is long and it's extended this year. Maybe there's another chance. So I just felt like, in terms of guys picking themselves up and saying, okay, what's next? This sucks. I don't want to be here right now, but what's next? Versus past renditions of this post game, Daniel, felt a little bit more like, this sucks, and how will I ever get out of this funk? So maybe that translates next week beyond. It's going to need to, but we'll learn a lot more about that. I think defensively, demoralizing way to finish it, right? You got 5 minutes on the clock. You're thinking, okay, really tough moment. The offense just got stood up at the 3-yard line. That was brutal. And yet, look, if we can maybe force a turnover or force a misstep here, we could put our offense on the doorstep again. Or a punt gives you the ball at midfield and you're still going to have time to work with, just like you did against USC. Go march down the field. Drew Aller already did it the series before with Tyler Warren. And instead, no more opportunities for the Penn State offense. They get a clock milking drive. I believe James Franklin called it a championship drive from Ohio State to finish out the game. Will Howard, the quarterback, who talked a lot about this week, being emotionally charged up as a Pennsylvania native, coming back to his home state. He delivered a couple big runs on that final possession. And so Drew Aller's final look and final opportunity in this one, because of that, was the incomplete pass on 4th and short from the goal line. And Kobe King said it was a, quote, sucky feeling to watch that clock, go down and not be able to get the Buckeyes off the field. But, he also talked about the pressure of, we got to give our offense. We got to give this for the offense, give them another chance. And I said this to you, Daniel, in the press box after we were gathering some of these quotes. Sure seems like the last couple of years, the defense has faced a lot of pressure to bail out the offense. Last year, the offense doesn't score a touchdown until the final quarter or final minute of the game in Columbus. To that point, the defense had really done its job. I think they forced 6 punts on the final 7 Ohio State possessions last year in Columbus. They did their job. And then this time around, they feel like we got to come up with a stop to get it back to our offense. And yet, I'm not going to say they played a perfect, complete game. They had missteps. They had penalties that were huge against them. Ohio State was able to gash them on a few occasions. But let's remember, this is a hell of a roster on the Buckeyes. And they got a lot of weapons. They got a strong coordinator in Chip Kelly. You saw that on display today. And yet, they only got 6 points, 2 field goal drives in the entire second half. And Daniel, for the second consecutive game in this series, I come away thinking, boy, I think the defense held up its end of the bargain. And I know that it doesn't look pretty because of what went down on that final possession, but we got to also acknowledge the constant left on the hook nature that they experienced in trying to make up for this offense in this matchup again.
When you talk about the joke that, like, oh yeah, I've seen this movie before, I think the defense really fits into that, where it feels like they got asked to do something like one too many times. I think that you think about 2 years ago in this game, the defense played really well through 3 quarters, but at the same time, it felt like a time bomb because you got CJ Stroud, Marvin Harrison Jr., whatever 5-star, Emeka Egbuka, somebody else who probably was a first-round pick, I'm forgetting. And you knew that at some point that was going to come alive. And then you had the offense turning the ball over, a pick six, then a short field, and then things just broke, like the dam broke. You think about last year where, that defense is standing on its head. It's keeping it a 1-score game. Marvin Harrison Jr. is getting his, but with Kyle McCord at quarterback, it turned into a very like station to station type of game. And Penn State was in it. The defense was keeping them in it. And it was a 1-score game for so much of that second half. And then the offense just could not take advantage. They could not hold up their end. Something similar I felt like today where, Ohio State goes ahead 14-10. We know that Penn State has been really good in the third quarter and second halves this year. And they came out and you saw that. And it was, okay, they're keeping offense, like they're keeping you in this. Like you gotta go, like you gotta do something. And then they had their chance, they failed, and then the defense doesn't have that, one more in it. I don't know how you get that one more. I don't know if like a $20 million NIL budget gets you that one more. Like, I don't know if a new defensive coordinator gets you that one more. I don't know if, more practices in the offseason, more physical training camp gets you that. But it just felt like there was one last time that defense was out there. And you looked at the circumstances. I mean, they're backed up all the way at the 1. It's on the side of the field with the student section. And then immediately Ohio State quarterback sneak for 4 yards. And then the breathing room is just there again. And it was just very, I think, I mean, if you're a Penn State fan, I'm sure you come away really frustrated by it because you look at the totality of the Ohio State offense. Judkins and Henderson, the 2 running backs, had really nice games, but you didn't feel like any one player was beating you. Like you didn't, Marvin Harrison Jr. wasn't there. CJ Stroud wasn't slinging it around. You didn't have Cade Stover making, some pretty crazy catches. Like you kept Jeremiah Smith in check. You kept Emeka Egbuka in check. Like it just felt like the defense was, kind of keeping things, where they needed to be. And they just couldn't do it for the full 60 minutes. Obviously, it's the cliche that you have to do this stuff for 60 minutes. But at the same time, if you're a team, you have to have the real look. You have to be a realist and know that you're not going to be able to keep it together. There's going to be lapses. And so you need to be prepared to pick each other up. And Penn State just wasn't able to do that today.
Neither quarterback went for 200 yards passing. You had Kinshawn Judkins at 95 yards on the ground and Travion Henderson at 54 yards on the ground, but there was no running back going for 130 on the day. And then, like you said, Jeremiah Smith, this is the first time in his college career he hasn't scored a touchdown. He scored a touchdown in his first 7 games, 8 of them total. And Emeka Egbuka, who's been a really lethal weapon for them the last several seasons, 3 catches, 31 yards. He did get in the end zone. But like you said, you look through this box score and Ohio State didn't do anything otherworldly to you, and no one did it individually to you. And so you had those opportunities to counterpunch. And you look at the drive chart for Penn State, and boy, did it start really promising for them. They took 8 minutes off the clock with their opening possession. They only got a field goal out of it, but it was a 14-play drive, and you're coming off of that right before you get the pick 6 and go up 10-0, but you're thinking, okay, Penn State's offense came to play today. Like they're ready to put together some drives. That wasn't just an accidental possession where they had a big spark play and then they had to settle for a field goal. Like they methodically drove the ball down. Well, they didn't go for 3 minutes on time of possession for the next 4 offensive series. They never totaled more than 50 yards on a possession again for the rest of the game until the final one. And again, it was a pretty drive, but it stalled out at the 3-yard line, down by 7 in the fourth quarter. So that's all anyone's going to remember about that possession. Daniel, we're going to pick apart this thing a lot more at Lions247.com in the next couple of days because that's our job. And we're going to do it on Monday as well on our next podcast when we bring Mark Brennan on board. It'll be the first time we've got to dissect a loss and do that in 2024. But coming out of this matchup, this team is 7-1. We heard from James Franklin and pretty much every player. They feel like they still have plenty to play for. They're not happy about the results today. They're not necessarily proud of them, I would say, but they feel like if they can put together a strong next 48 hours and get out of what this is going to, the hurt that's going to be there for them when they get in the facilities tomorrow, and honestly look in the mirror, which James Franklin says no one's looking in the mirror as hard as him right now. If you can get through that, come out the other side of it, then yes, there is a new reality in play for college football where Penn State could end up in the Big Ten championship game. But if they don't end up there, they could still end up back here, right behind us on the field in Beaver Stadium for a first-round playoff game that they're hosting. But, of course, they've got to get it together, and they've got a few more games here in November to actually get through and reach the finish line at 11-1 and maybe put themselves in that conversation. Daniel, what do you think about this team's, ability based on post-game feedback, what we've witnessed so far this year, about them coming through this and not being hungover, not being sorry for themselves, but instead maybe finding a spark out of it, maybe getting a little angry out of it, but finishing the task at hand and putting yourself in the best possible position to not just finally break through into the college football playoff, but to break through in the college football playoff and not make a quick exit with a whimper, but to make some noise in late December, maybe get into January and keep making noise and put this first November Saturday far back in the rearview mirror.
I think we're all going through a big recalibration when it comes to college football. Talking to guys like Sal Wormley and Devon J. Thomas after the game, this is their sixth straight loss to Ohio State. And they're passing on the message from James Franklin about how everything they want is still ahead of them. There's still a light at the end of the tunnel. But at the same time, they're coming out of a game against an opponent that they know very well, that they've come close against. And emotionally, the past 5 years that they've done it has more or less ended their season. I know that last year they still had the Michigan opportunity after they lost to Ohio State in October, but it was just so significant. It's seismic. Like every game was seismic.
Daniel, I would just note this because there was the divisions. It felt like if you lost to Ohio State, even if it was in October or late September, then you needed not only to end up with the same record as Ohio State at the end of the season to get a chance to go to Indy, but you'd have to maybe have them lose 2 games. So it always felt like, man, now you got to hope Ohio State falls apart. You got to win out because you had to get to Indy to even have a chance to get to the playoff because they weren't going to give the third place team in the Big Ten a spot in the playoff. That's off the table now.
Yeah, that's a great point. I wasn't even looking at it through the divisionless point of view, but so I think that it is a little bit of a different view. Both Wormley and Jay Thomas, they both said more or less that it sucks to lose to Ohio State that many times, that it hurts. Devon had to take a couple moments to collect himself during his availability as he was talking about some of just the work that goes into this and how it feels to fall short in a situation like this again and again. But yeah, I mean, what they everything they want is ahead of them. You have to take care of business, and your margin for error is pretty much zero now, because I know that a 2-loss team can probably make it into the postseason, but you look at what's left on Penn State's schedule, and then you look at the wins that they have on their resume to begin with. I don't know if 10-2 is something that will be appealing outside of maybe a 10 or 11 seed. It could put you in a tough spot. I do think we talked about this a little bit too, where this whole "we're going to see Ohio State again" type of mantra. I mean, it was interesting to me because even though we're out of the divisions and one of the big talking points with divisionless structures is that teams can play each other again more often in that conference championship. But you look at the Big Ten right now, Oregon's undefeated, Indiana's undefeated, Ohio State is going to have the tiebreaker on you. Like, you're still in almost a similar spot to where you would be if you just lost a game in the Big Ten East, where not only do you need to take care of business, but you would need help to get into get to Indianapolis. And I'm sure along the way, at some point, might be this year, might be next year, might be the next year, we're probably going to get pretty deep into those Big Ten tiebreaker scenarios to figure out exactly how it's going to work. But I do think that when it comes down to it, this is about winning the games. And I think going into the game, you could start to game things out a little bit. If they were to lose, throw that out the window for 3.5 hours. Now you can go back to gaming things out. And I think the result that you come out to is you got a slim margin for error. This is the first year of an unprecedented thing. So you don't necessarily know what is going to be valued, how it's going to be weighted. I do think that this is a game that you needed to win, because I think if you're Penn State, you just can't leave anything up to chance. That's like the one thing that I always come back to. It, like in the small, in the micro picture, it's like the Elliott Washington unsportsmanlike conduct penalty, where, yeah, I mean, I thought it was a weak call. I thought it was a soft call. I didn't think it was a call that was going to be made, but you still left the door open for it to happen. And I think that in the big picture, where you look at the college football playoff in Penn State, now they're at the mercy of some other forces. I think that you can say that you'll take care of business and you'll get there, which is true, but margin for error is less. There's more factors involved now. You're going to be dependent on some other things to hopefully break your way, which is a tough spot to be in. So yeah, I think that coming out of this game, looking forward, I still feel good about Penn State. I'll do the college football playoff projections roundup later this week, and I'm sure they'll still be in there. They'll still be high seeds. I'm still blocking off that weekend in December as a weekend I'm going to have to work. But the complexion is just a little different now.
Yeah, and this is a team that when we saw them get knocked to the canvas last year, wasn't so pretty. It wasn't so pretty, and we'll get a chance to see real soon. Whiteout game here against Washington.
It's a good way to reset.
Yeah, it's and I know that these players they heard some of the reaction from the fans. Sal Wormley went so far as to apologize for the performance today, and then say that they know the fans come here to see a show and they wanted to give that to them. But I think overall it just felt like a swing and a miss once again, and Penn State kind of left there staring ahead and saying, what could have been? This was our moment. Everyone was dialed in. You could beat Washington by 50 next week in a whiteout atmosphere. It'll be on TV. People will watch it, but people will not embrace it and say, this is who that program is. This is what James Franklin is about. Drew Aller could throw for 4 touchdowns and a 90% completion percentage against Washington, but more people would remember what he didn't accomplish against Ohio State. That's how it works in big boy football right now, and that's since that night 6 years ago when Devon J. Thomas was here in Beaver Stadium as a visiting recruit, and James Franklin talked about what it was going to take for them to get to the next step after that 1-point loss to Ohio State. Unfortunately, unless Devon gets a chance at these guys in Indianapolis or in the postseason, this 2019 recruiting class will be the third consecutive class going back to 2017 and 18 that will come here to Penn State, win a bunch of games, play New Year's Six Bowls, maybe get to the playoffs this year, but not beat Ohio State. And that is a tough pill to swallow for anyone involved in the Penn State community. Daniel, we'll come back on Monday. We'll do our best to break things down, start to turn attention towards what comes next. We'll bring Mark Brennan on board. But again, a lot going on at Lions247.com. It was a good day for recruiting. They picked up a top 24/7 Matt Sieg, a top 24/7 safety in the state. There's going to be a ton of recruiting coverage coming out of that from Brian Doan, Tyler Calvaruso, and company over at Lions247.com. And you better believe we'll have a lot in reaction to what we witnessed between Penn State and Ohio State. Stories, breakdowns, analysis, all coming your way on the site. For now, stepping aside here at Beaver Stadium, we'll be back in just a week for the whiteout. I am Tyler Donahue. He is Daniel Gowan. We'll talk to you soon right here on the Lions 24/7 podcast.